What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Welcome back to America Trends, Larry Rifkin and John Krofsik. And John, I think people are startled when they think that in many ways the 13 colonies had the patina of little theocracies in the old days, that there was a religious tinge to America at a certain point in time. And then, of course, when we wrote up the Constitution, we really decided that separation of church and state was a really important concept. Now, today, we take that for granted. But at that time, when they were writing this document, John, that was amazing. That was such a brilliant thought. The idea that, hey, why don't we have a competition among religions and let everybody have their own idea and let it be more laissez-faire, the government not being involved in religion.
Isn't that why we came here? I mean, the Church of England was really coming down on everybody with... And people wanted to be free of that. So, I mean, that, you know, they came to this country to be free from that.
But I'll tell you, in the podcast that you're about to hear, one of the things that shocked me, absolutely shocked me, and that's the reason I still do podcasts, and I love doing them for you, is the fact that I learn so darn much from people. And I learned from Stephen Waldman the reason why we are not a Christian nation. Now, in many ways, of course, Christianity does dominate our society, but we have many other religions. Now, many other religions, and I'm of a different religion, have had to force their way in.
Still, Christianity and Judaism is pretty close. I mean,
well, they are close. They are aligned, but we've had our issues. But what I found fascinating was that the internecine battle between Catholics and Protestants is probably the larger reason that we're not a Christian state. Now, does that shock you?
Well, I think the Protestants broke away from the Catholic Church, right? So, yeah, that really doesn't shock me.
Really? Because when I heard that, it just never really dawned on me that it was Protestants, you know, and Catholics fighting with each other that made it unlikely that Christianity could take full hold in America.
I often question the pomp and circumstance of the Catholic Church. I mean, and then, you know, you see what is going on with the Catholic Church. I mean, I sort of understand why there's a
little schism there.
Yeah.
Well, that schism goes way back, as we know. Many other grievances, as were posted many years ago by Luther. But when you do look at it, we have 360,000 churches of worship or places of worship in America. And I did get into the issue even of atheism. Is that really the toughest thing to be in the United States? Because we're one of the few industrialized, westernized populations that still really loves capitalism, but also loves its churches, believes that both can live side by side. It's really interesting to see how America has evolved as it relates to religion. Having said that, I think what I find most interesting is the way that James Madison carved out a really special place for religion in America as kind of a marketplace of different ideas and approaches, saying that the best thing we can do is keep our hands off this whole bloody thing called religion. Now, we haven't done it always by any stretch of the imagination, but we've probably done a better job of it than anywhere else in the world, thanks to the thoughts that he had at that time.
Yeah, I mean, well, let's face it, even when they wrote the Constitution and all, I mean, religion was still up front. I mean, look at our money, in God we trust.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, so...
But, and we were all, as I said, little theocracies in the New England states. I mean, we were run as theocracies.
But we have done a pretty good job, I think, of with the separation of church and state, and with keeping our hands off of it.
Yeah, and we're now testing that a bit as it relates to inviting many other sects in, Muslims and such. And so America's always evolving and trying to bend, we hope, toward more justice over time. But we really tackled this issue with a lot of intent on this podcast. Stephen Waldman is with us. The book is called Sacred Liberty, America's Long, Bloody, and Ongoing Struggle for Religious Freedom. It's well worth your time.
On the line with us on America Trends is Stephen Waldman. He's a journalist, an entrepreneur, and the author of the best-selling book Founding Faith. He was the co-founder of BeliefNet, the award-winning multi-faith website, and he's got all kinds of other credits to his name. And he's also got a new book called Sacred Liberty, America's Long, Bloody, and Ongoing Struggle for Religious Freedom. Stephen, thanks for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
Do you think that one of the great enigmas, even to this modern day America, relates to the founders and the way that their religious beliefs and our religious protections really came about?
Yeah, I think it's both of those points are true, that we have religious freedom now, which I think is one of our greatest inventions, but we have very little idea of how we got it. And secondly, that the founders' views on all this are much, well, not just misunderstood, but kind of abused. People tend to quote founding fathers to prove whatever they want to prove, whatever their argument is. And there's plenty of quotes from the founding fathers to prove almost anything. And it gets very confusing how it was that we ended up with this system of religious freedom, which has eventually worked well, but there's a lot of misconceptions about how all this happened.
Now to James Madison and your obvious appreciation for his role in designing what you call a counterintuitive approach to our greatest invention. What was that?
We had two big ideas. One was that the best way to encourage religion was to leave it alone. And that may seem obvious now, but that was actually pretty revolutionary back then in the rest of the world and also in the American colonies. The idea was that if you wanted to encourage religion, the government should get in there and encourage religion, have an official state religion, use tax dollars to help promote it, pay the ministers' salaries, things like that. And he thought, as did the kind of Baptists and other dissidents back then, that not only led to persecution or oppression, it also led to laziness on the part of the religions and less creativity. So he thought if you stepped back and had more of a free market, that would lead to religious vibrancy. And the second point he made, he had this sort of very clunky phrase he used called the multiplicity of sects, S-E-C-T-S. And what he meant by that was that the real way to have freedom is not so much fancy declarations of rights, but actually a lot of different religions competing for adherence. And he thought that that was a good idea because it would keep any one religion from dominating the others and oppressing the others. So it's a little like his views about political power in general, but it was this idea that pluralism would end up guaranteeing religious freedom.
If somebody goes back and looks at the founders, they may come up with terms like a deist or an Orthodox Christian. And so explain what those terms really mean for those of us today. And how was he able to cobble together this notion of a free marketplace of ideas and leaving religion alone, given the multiplicity of views that the founders had?
Yeah, I sort of think that anytime someone says, the founding fathers believed blank, the rest of the sentence is probably not true, whatever it is, because there was a diversity of views among the founders, including on religion. So there were, in a way, these kind of groups. So you had what you might call the Enlightenment thinkers. That was people like Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine and Benjamin Franklin. And they were not atheists, they were religious, but they thought that in effect God's greatest gift was the human mind, and that we should leave the human mind free. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we had the sort of traditionalists who were, attended church and wanted the churches to be strong, and in a lot of cases even believed in the old system of the government subsidizing the churches. And then you had people in between, like George Washington and John Adams, who wanted there to be much more religious freedom, but they also were quite comfortable with the government playing a role in religion. Like, Washington as president issued prayer proclamations as an example. So he thought that kind of public religion was important. So Madison, in a way, was the guy who had to create a coalition around these different views to lead to what we ended up with as the First Amendment and other protections for religious freedom. And one of the most surprising things that I learned in the course of researching sacred liberty is that his chief ally or set of allies were what we would now call evangelical Christians. They were basically the Baptists of Virginia, and they were really his teammates in this fight. They came at it from very different reasons. They were very religious, but they really supported his approach, in part because they had been so persecuted in Virginia. In fact, historically, one of the most important episodes of persecution in American history was about of attacks against Baptists in Northern Virginia in the 1760s and 1770s, because it was right near James Madison's house. And he literally was, hearing about this wave of persecution. So it was not an abstraction for him. It wasn't just about, reading about religious wars in Europe. He knew it firsthand, and that had a big impact on him.
Who was the most skeptical of the founders? I mean, I could talk all day about the founders. I do want to bring it to even some more modern-day concerns based upon their work. But was it Ben Franklin or Jefferson?
Yeah, I'd say it's a close race between Jefferson and Franklin. They both had been described as deists. I think the one thing that we forget about the deists back then, or at least was true of Jefferson, is that he was really rejecting organized religion, but he did believe in a God that intervened in human affairs. So even the definition of deist back then was a little more, imagined a God that was a little more involved than I think we would think today. Jefferson was complicated because he was very, very angry about religion and what had happened to Christianity. He thought that it had pretty much been ruined from the start, literally, with the apostles, and that it just got worse from there. And so, as you know, he did this extraordinary thing of editing the Bible, where he took a razor and cut out the parts that he didn't like. And so he was very romantic in a way about Jesus. He wrote about Jesus very eloquently, about him being the greatest moral teacher of all time. And his approach to religion often was almost like he was trying to rescue Jesus from everyone that had ruined his religion after him. So it was complicated, and and so for that reason, he was a little bit, even in his day, idiosyncratic. And as president, when he was running for election, he was attacked by a lot of the traditional religious people for being, almost a heretic because of his unorthodox views.
What about Ben Franklin, briefly?
Well, he kind of evolved over the course of his life, and as a younger man, grew up in Puritan Boston and had pretty traditional views, and then he became what he described himself at one point as being a deist. But at the end of his life, he kind of had the ultimate fudge when someone asked him, did God exist? And he basically said, I'll find out soon. And I don't know. It's like, yeah, not much coming from me thinking about it much more. We'll find out. So that kind of summarized his approach at the end.
What about the First Amendment? I mean, how misunderstood is it, separation of church and state? I mean, because when you do look back at the early colonies, of course, they were Christian polities, many of them. And so people might be confused about really what was intended by the First Amendment.
Right. It really is one of very confusing and very politicized in modern times. So two things. One is that the concept that Madison wanted for the First Amendment did involve a fair amount of separation of church and state. He really believed in that. So the idea that that was a concept that was invented later is not true. That was what he was after. But he lost on some key matters. He wanted this to apply to everyone. But he had to accept a really important compromise, which is that the states didn't want the federal government to tell them how to regulate or not regulate religion. So the First Amendment, when it passed, only applied to laws by the U.S. Congress. And it pretty much left the states to do whatever they wanted. The states were free to, have a single religion. And in fact, for years after the passage of the First Amendment, Massachusetts and Connecticut did have official or semi-official status to the congregational churches. So it was really up to the states. And that left all sorts of regulation of religion still in place in a way that was not what Madison wanted. So that's kind of the key thing about the First Amendment. And it means that what you then have to understand is what happened after the Civil War with the passage of the 14th Amendment. And that became really important because that was when the courts started to apply the principles of the First Amendment down on the state and local level. And that's why today we have fights over, prayer in school or the creche on the city hall lawn, very, very local things. That was not the original intention of the First Amendment, but it was the intention of the kind of first plus 14th put together.
Interesting. I think a lot of people will find that new information. What about the notion that you put forward that I found quite interesting, that the reason for not becoming a Christian state, aside from these protections that ultimately built over the years, was the antipathy of Protestants toward Catholics? I just had never really put that in my own way of thinking about these issues.
Yeah, it's really, I have to say, this sort of surprised me as the deeper I got into research in this, is that the antipathy to Catholics from the Protestant majority was so deep and so long-lasting for the first, 150 years, certainly before the Constitution, but then a good 100 years after that, that it really affected a lot of these different issues. So when we talk about Christian America back there, no one really wanted a Christian America. There were people who wanted a Protestant America very much as a way of keeping Catholics out. It was really, as they say in the tech world, this was a feature, not a bug, of the American experiment, this anti-Catholicism. And the astonishing quotes from, John Adams and Alexander Hamilton and beloved founding fathers about how much they hated Catholics, things that would be considered really just, rank bigotry now. But remember that they were all they were students of Europe, and where Europe was still in the middle of these religious wars, and where the Catholic Church was a often regressive force. So they kind of viewed Catholicism as against the Enlightenment and against democracy, which was, I would say one of the most common errors that happens in the course of American history is that people take some fear that they have of a religion, let's say in this case, say Catholics in the 1800s, and they say, the Vatican believes this or that, therefore we can't trust American Catholics. And in fact, American Catholics in the 1700s and 1800s and thereon were good American citizens abiding by American rules of democracy and religious freedom and all that. So, but part of the anti-Catholic bigotry was that the Pope was going to basically come and run the country and tell everyone what to do. So it really was a very powerful part of the story.
Yeah, it persisted even in the 1960 election with JFK. On the line with us, Stephen Waldman, the author of Founding Faith, a best-selling book, and now Sacred Liberty. And we're talking primarily about the writings in that book. Explain to us, if in fact there was this divide and this schism between Catholics and Protestants,
You also say that when we look at it, there are so many groups, Quakers, Mormons, Jews, and others, who've had to fight so hard to demand the religious freedom and the leaving religion alone watchword that Madison put forward and got consensus around. Why has it been so difficult for so many of these groups as well?
It's a great question. That's one of the sort of mysteries I tried to unravel with this, and we really didn't have religious freedom in a robust sense for most of our history, and it did take these constant fights and just horrible, brutal persecution of certain groups. Mormon persecution, I mean, is in some ways the most astonishing. You know, in the 1830s, the governor of Missouri issued an extermination order calling for the extermination of the Mormons in Missouri. And in the 30s, you know, Catholic churches and convents were being burnt to the ground, and Jehovah's Witnesses were being practically tortured in the 20th century. And I think part of it is that people tended to say, we like religious freedom, but what they really meant is we like religious freedom for people like us. And, of course, it's not really religious freedom if it's not universal. And so there was always this tension between we like religious freedom, but we also want the majority religion to kind of establish the ground rules and the culture. So that tension just never went away. And so you'd always have whatever the majority was in a given spot, mostly Protestants, would want to, persist in having their values dominate. Like, so an example, a lot of the fights in the 1800s between Protestant and Catholics involved which Bible to teach in the public schools. Not whether to teach the Bible, but which one. And the Protestants insisted that the Catholics use the King James Bible, which the Catholics viewed as the Protestant translation and the Protestant version of the Ten Commandments. But the Protestants basically wanted to enforce, their traditions on everyone else, and they thought, in effect, we were here first, and the founding fathers were Protestant, and we shouldn't have to give up the core values of, that we brought to the country.
How does the persecution of these groups help us to understand the nature of attacks today, let's say, on American Muslims, which I believe you called one of the greatest threats to our freedom to practice our own religions. So get into that issue for us.
Yeah, it's really striking how often the attacks on American Muslims today are the same attacks that we saw on Catholics and Mormons. For instance, they would say Catholicism isn't really a religion, or Mormonism isn't a religion. It's a political system, which is something that you hear a lot now about Islam. It's not really a religion. It's a political system. And that said, in order to make the case for why they shouldn't have First Amendment protections. It's not a religion, then it doesn't deserve freedom of religion. And the critics are actually pretty upfront about that. It's often tied with immigration and the notion that these people are alien and anti-democratic, that they won't absorb American democratic values, that they can't assimilate. So that argument was a key argument against Catholics and Mormons, and it's now said against Muslims, or that they're basically being controlled by a foreign power or a foreign set of laws. So in the case of the Catholics, of course, it was the Vatican and Catholic law. In the case of Muslims, it's Sharia. It's the notion that Muslims can't be good citizens because they have to follow this foreign law. And, what started out as a kind of fringe group that were making these arguments against Muslims, it just picked up steam in the last 10 years to the point where now in 2015, a poll showed that only half of Republicans were willing to say that Islam should be legal in America. And you have communities around the country that blocking the construction of mosques. So you're not talking about, should they have special treatment or something. You're talking about really attacks and erosion of very baseline fundamental principles of religious freedom. And it's alarming how quickly that consensus can unravel.
But if so many conflicts pit our worldview, including religious tolerance and pluralism, against other worldviews where religion dominates the political culture, how have we done on balance since 9/11? And certainly include this period of the Trump administration. But in the wake of that, do you think we've done better than some might have thought, given the attack on the nation and how much it was tied to a worldview that was apart from ours?
Yes, I really do, and I think it sort of proves, I call the religious freedom model America's greatest invention, and I think that the last 20 years or so sort of have borne that out despite the problems. And it was an amazing moment about 6 months after 9/11, they did a poll, and it showed that Americans' perception of Islam had improved after 9/11. Which is really astonishing because, especially I'm looking at the history here, and you have all these cases where false rumors had led to riots and convents being burned down and things like that. And here you had a situation where it was true that the hijackers were Muslim, and it was true that they invoked Allah, and that Osama bin Laden was being harbored by, a radical Muslim regime. That was all true. So it wouldn't have been surprising if that had manifest in terms of a real anti-Muslim backlash in America. And there was some of it, but it was not nearly what you would expect. I really do think part of the credit for that initially goes to George W. Bush, who really had quite a, I'd say, enlightened view of religious freedom, and he made the point that, may seem obvious, but at that moment was really critical that, we're fighting this war against Islamic terrorism and extremism, but at the same time we have to defend the rights of American Muslims who are patriotic Americans, and he just made that very clear distinction between the bad guys over there and your neighbors. And so part of it, I think he deserves some credit, but part of it also is just that the notion of religious pluralism had gotten sufficiently, deeply ingrained, and you can see it in contrast to the way other countries deal with religion now. I mean, 75% of the world's population now lives in countries that do not have religious freedom. Mm-hmm. So America's approach is not just good, compared to the past few thousand years. It's also, does quite well compared to most countries now. Like I was doing this, when I was working on the research for my chapter on the Jehovah's Witnesses, which is another amazing one. It was a small religion that was just brutalized. I mean, get rounded up, and the guy was castrated for being a Jehovah's Witness, and this is like in the World War II period. So I'm reading about this ancient history, and as I'm doing that, I read a headline saying Russia has banned Jehovah's Witnesses as a religion. Not, harassed. They just made it illegal. So, and that's in modern Russia. So it's we sometimes can lose track of how much better off we are, and we're also better off in another way. I remember seeing this amazing, sort of a graph that the Pew Research Center did, where they looked at the relationship between religion and wealth of a country. Mm-hmm. And basically what they found is you had clustered one part of the chart, you had all these countries that were very religious but poor, Ethiopia and Sudan and Afghanistan. And then on the other part of the chart, you had countries that were wealthy and tolerant but not particularly religious anymore. England and Australia and Germany were pretty secular. And then there's this one stray dot on the graph all the way in the upper right, which is the one country that is both wealthy, tolerant, and religious, the United States. So the unique thing about our approach, as opposed to France or other countries that emphasize secularism, is that we have freedom, but we also have set it up in a way that leads to religious vitality, a lot of religious health to it. So that's the other part of why I think the case for why our model is really working pretty well.
Well, we, of course, have been talking about keeping government out of religion, and that's one thing. But what about the role of religion entering into the political realm? And we're seeing a lot of that. For example, you talk about religious conservatives, and you say they have been transformed from this moral majority, which got very involved in politics, to a persecuted in their mind minority in their thinking, and that they're developing all these new legal strategies, and maybe the abortion fight is part of that. So talk about it the reverse, religion getting involved in politics in modern-day America.
Yeah, it's an amazing shift. So starting around the 1970s, evangelical Christians who had for a long time kind of withdrawn from politics decided to get involved from the conservative side, the moral majority group and other, abortion issue and others like that. And it happened slowly, but it became, a really important force in American politics for a few decades. Flashing forward to now, the evangelicals who are smaller in numbers now and are now pitching themselves or feeling like they are a persecuted minority. And it large part comes from the progress that had been made or how far gay rights had advanced. And so what's interesting is that the conservative Christians are now using the same legal tactics that liberal religious groups used 20 years ago. So, for instance, there was a famous case where a Native American church said that we should be exempt from the anti-drug laws because peyote, a hallucinogenic drug, is part of our religious tradition. So that sometimes, you should be exempt from certain laws if it infringes on your religion. So conservative Christians are now using that argument when it comes to gay rights, that we should be excused from anti-discrimination rules if it infringes on our belief system, including the belief system against same-sex marriage. So it's kind of turned on its head, and we are in this world right now, this moment, when the courts and Congress and society has sort of gone beyond viewing religious freedom as just an absence of persecution, and now goes farther and says, actually, we want to bend over backwards to give religious groups extra room. And so that's why you would have, people saying they should be exempt from, Obamacare because it has a contraceptive mandate, or you should be exempt from, serving cake at a same-sex marriage because it infringes on your religious views.
Or even vaccinations today. A lot of the anti-vaxxers are using the religious exemption.
Right. That's a great example. And it also starts to raise the question of when have we gone too far, allowing people to be excused from from secular laws for religious purposes. And that's, I think, one of the toughest modern issues. I think in one sense, I do think that that's a really important kind of advancement, this idea that for religious freedom to be robust, you got to give religious believers some room. I'll give you an example that is a little more sympathetic maybe, is there was a case where Seventh-day Adventists made the case that, they were being forced to work on Saturdays but their Sabbath was on Saturday and everyone else's was on Sunday. And so the court said, that's not fair. That's not real religious freedom. We should make it so that they don't have to work on Saturdays. We're going to excuse them from the law. So we can all imagine certain cases where that seems fair to let, a religious group to be exempted from a rule like that. Or you wouldn't want to make a Catholic nun at a Catholic hospital be involved in performing an abortion. We all get the idea that, there should be exceptions made, but it's turned out to be very hard to know where to draw the line.
And, when we look at it, the left, of course, in the 1960s, with Martin Luther King using religion as a precept in terms of more social justice. Now you've got those on the right saying, what about our moral concerns about abortion? Is it healthy
in this pluralistic society for those arguments which are founded in religion, very different kinds of approaches to political action. Is that a healthy thing as you see it?
It's a really great question. I where I come down on it is I think it is fine and sometimes healthy for people to have their political beliefs motivated by their religion. You know, some of the most important, you know, movements of progress in American history, whether it's abolitionism or the civil rights movement, were driven by religion. And we wouldn't have had these tremendous advances toward a more perfect union without that kind of religious motivation. Now, the problem comes when it's not just a matter of religious motivation, but you basically are saying, this is my religion, that's that, it should be the law. Like, that's not, you can't force it on other people just because it's your religion. It can motivate you, but you still have to make a secular argument to other people for why it's good for them and why it's good for the whole country. So I do think it has an appropriate role, and so, you know, what I often say to my friends on the left who don't like the use of religion, you know, by conservatives, well, how would you feel if like during the Iraq War, it had been said, well, you're allowed to oppose the Iraq War for practical reasons, but you're not allowed to oppose it for moral or religious reasons. Or you're allowed to be in favor of civil rights for blacks for practical reasons, but you're not allowed to be in favor of it for religious reasons. You know, so I think that we're accustomed right now to thinking of that as a card that's only played by conservatives, but at other moments in American life, it was liberals who were making religious arguments for things. And I just think it has to be done in a way that understands that, like, you don't get to just assert your religion as the dominant religion, and that's that. You can be motivated by it, but you still are in a pluralistic society where you have to convince people. And very often making the religious argument does the opposite. You know, if you're making an argument for, say, you know, abortion, a ban on abortion, and the entirety of your argument is life begins at conception, according to the Bible, well, you're not going to persuade anyone who doesn't agree with you about the Bible. So while I think it's, you know, certainly legal to make that kind of argument, it's unwise and counterproductive.
In the few minutes we have left, recently Mayor Pete Buttigieg and former Governor and now Vice President Mike Pence and Mayor Pete saying, well, you're using the notion of religious freedom as simply a cloak to discriminate against people. And then, of course, with this anti-vax movement, when societal health and safety runs up against religious beliefs, do you see those conflicts as being something that we're going to see more of going forward in a divided America, that some of those fault lines can't be defined to some extent by those who are more religious and those who are more secular?
Yeah, I think probably we are going to see more of it, and I do think we'll also see more claims of people saying that if you disagree with them, you're violating their religious freedom, which usually is not accurate. You know, that's not a fair use of religious freedom, but people are sometimes using the idea of religious freedom as a kind of a cloak to, you know, just defend their views if their views might be unpopular. On the other hand, I guess where I would disagree with Mayor Pete is to say that, you know, Mike Pence is perfectly within his rights not only to, you know, be opposed to same-sex marriage, but to have religious motivation for why he opposes same-sex marriage. I don't think that's a violation of the separation of church and state for Mike Pence to have those views. I also don't think it's an attack on his religious freedom if you disagree with him.
In closing, we talked about some of the differences among religions, but trying to work out those opportunities to have your place in the religious marketplace. Where does that leave, as you see it, people who some think are the last to get any consideration if they ever ran for president, an atheist, avowed, or an agnostic? Where do they fit in America?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a recent poll that said that the only group that ranked lower than Muslims in terms of would you be willing to vote for this person if they had this religion, was atheists. It is still the great taboo. Less so than it used to be, but still an overwhelming majority of people said that they wouldn't vote for an atheist. And, I have mixed feelings about it because I think it's against the spirit of religious freedom and certainly the model that we have that gives you the freedom to believe also is what gives you the freedom not to believe. I think the founders would be sad if they thought that America was becoming a majority atheist country, because they really genuinely did believe that in order for you to have a democracy, that religion needed to be an important part of it. But I do think that the principles of religious freedom that give every religion the right to follow their own path absolutely also apply to atheists.
Stephen Waldman, I can't thank you enough for being with us today on America Trends. The book is called Sacred Liberty, America's Long, Bloody, and Ongoing Struggle for Religious Freedom. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Great conversation.
America Trends podcast is part of the MHNR Network, mhnrnetwork.com.